Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Um, this is going to be a spicy video, just heads up. This is Console Wars Part 4 in my ongoing series, the CD Rom Era. Now, specifically, this is pre-Saturn and PlayStation. We're talking about the early days of CD Rom games here. So, we're talking a little bit about PC CD-ROM, and I don't mean TurboGrafx in Japan. I mean CD-ROMs on the PC, DOS, Windows, etc. But we're not talking about that so much today. Like I said, we'll dabble just because we have to. But we're talking about TurboGrafx CD. We're talking about Sega CD. We're talking about Philips CDI, Neo Geo CD. We're talking about Jaguar CD. Did I say Sega CD? Yeah, and 3DO. Um, 3DO we're only going to touch on because of its overlap with Sega CD, but I'm pretty much saving 3DO for the 32-bit era discussion because the 3DO is pretty much the jumping off point or the beginning of the 32-bit era. Even though it didn't really get into full force until Saturn and PlayStation came along. So CD-ROM gaming, for those who aren't familiar with it, started in the late 80s. And the first CD-ROMs were for computers, and they didn't do much for video games. And I have to remember, video games as a whole were still fairly primitive back then. So the biggest, in the early days, the biggest noticeable difference between a game on a floppy disk or a cartridge at the time versus a game on a CD-ROM would have been the introduction of CD quality audio. However, some of the computers at the time could do FM audio anyways, and some of them had tape drives. So you had a form of CD quality audio, not necessarily true CD quality audio, but you had a form of audio, voices in games, digitized voices, we'll say, prior to the introduction to CD-ROM. But CD-ROM, that at its introduction, that was the selling point. Now, as time and technology advanced, game companies started to learn how to put a little bit more advanced animation in their CD-ROM games. Again, in the early days, it was basically like the same kind of cutscene you would get on an NES or Genesis game, but it had some movement. So it would be a JPEG with, or a bitmap or whatever, a static image basically, where the characters would turn their head or open their mouths or do a dramatic pose or something like that. But there wasn't a lot of full on animation in the early days. Once the CDI and the Sega CD and the 3DO hit the scene, full motion video really came into its own. And this is what a lot of people remember about the CD-ROM era. They remember the FMV games. So when people talk about Sega CD, most of the time they're talking about Night Trap, they're talking about Sewer Shark, Tomcat Alley, Who Shot Johnny Rock, stuff like that. But that's not all the CD-ROM consoles were good for. So we're going to kind of take them one at a time. Like I said, focusing mostly on consoles. Because you could do the stuff you could do on a CD-ROM on a computer with a floppy disk. It just took 10 floppy disks, where the CD-ROM was one disk. So at that time, the advantage of a CD-ROM, at least on the computer side, was getting rid of multiple disks. So you could have bigger games without having to have multiple floppy disks. Whereas you didn't really have that problem on the console side, because once a game was on a cartridge, it was final. There was no patches, DLC updates, nothing. It was what it was, and you were stuck with it. But you had way more space on the CD-ROM, so you could have more content. Like I said, you could have FMVs, cutscenes, audio, etc. So the first CD-ROM console was an attachment to the PC Engine in Japan and the TurboGrafx 16 in the United States, and this was simply known as the Turbo CD in the US or PC CD-ROM in Japan. We're talking about the US here, because that's where I live and that's where my knowledge base lies and my experience is. So, most of the games on the Turbo CD were arcade ports that just wouldn't fit on the little cards, the Hue cards that they used. They might have fit on an NES cartridge or a Master System cartridge because they had more space, but those Hue cards did not have a lot of space on them, a lot of storage capacity. So the advantage of most games, I would say 90% of the games on the Turbo CD, is pretty much just the extra storage space. You could have more levels, you could have bigger games. They didn't really use too much in the way of FMVs, although they did dabble. And there wasn't a lot of like, CD audio, CD quality audio. But they did have that. Some of them did have that. But for the most part, it was just games that wouldn't have easily fit on a Hue card. Or at least until Hue card technology advanced. There's not a lot of games on the Turbo CD, and I'll save you the trouble. There's none worth your time. Just get the Hue card version or get the same game on another system and be happy with that, because the games that are on the Turbo, the games on the Turbo graphics aren't all that great to begin with, let alone on the CD-ROM. So let's just move along. The next CD-ROM system, I believe, was released in 1991 or 1992. I'm not 100%. But it was the Philips CDI. The CDI was not a game console. It was a home computer entertainment system, sort of like a DVD player, a multimedia DVD player. Kind of like a Roku before its time. It was intended to be a multimedia device, which is why it's called CDI, CD Interactive, Compact Disc Interactive. Yes, it does technically play video games, but it also does other types of software, because it's kind of halfway between a console and a computer. And if you have the MPEG video card attachment upgrade, you can watch video CDs on it, which was a new format introduced at the time. The CDI also came out around the same time as the Sega CD. And so the CDI and the Sega CD do share a lot of games in their software library. So a lot of games that are on the Sega CD, you can find on the CDI and vice versa. However, the CDI is unique in that there was an iffy deal with Nintendo that allowed the CDI to get a couple Nintendo games, a couple of crappy Zelda games, and Hotel Mario. This is a whole complicated, messy story for another day, for another video. But yeah. The Sega CD, however, was probably, of the add-ons, not just the most successful, but the most well-rounded in the software library and the most fully developed in terms of technology and what you can do with it. And I say that because the Sega CD had a lot more good games on it than people realize. Yes, it did have some FMV games, and most of them do suck. I'm not going to blow smoke up your ass. They do suck. But some of them aren't as bad as you think they are or have been told they are. Sewer Shark is a perfectly fine game. Tomcat Alley is a perfectly fine game. Night Trap, that's a whole video. That's a whole another video for another day. But some of them weren't bad. They weren't bad. They were pretty good games. They were interesting for what they were. Make My Video is a pretty good game. Sue me. I still think it's a pretty good game. But the Sega CD was also really known for having games like Genesis games that were enhanced on the Sega CD. So this would be like Mortal Kombat was on the Genesis, Mortal Kombat was on the Sega CD. The Sega CD version had like CD audio, it had some more animation, it had some, special features, things like that, bonus content and stuff like that. So you had a lot of games like that that were Genesis games on the Sega CD. But you also had games that were ports of PC games or games that existed on other systems like the Turbo CD, the CDI, the 3DO, etc. And so those games were out there, and they were pretty cool. Some of them, And you had original games for the Sega CD as well, like Ultraverse Prime was an original game for the Sega CD, a pretty solid side-scrolling beat 'em up. The Terminator game on the Sega CD is a pretty rock solid, I guess I would say action game, side-scrolling action game. Sonic CD for the Sega CD is a pretty fucking kick-ass game. Pretty dope entry in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. And then there were just Sega CD ports of games that were on everything. This would be like your sports games, Wheel of Fortune, stuff like that. Your games that were on everything at the time. Your big multi-platform, third-party, your generic games. Some would say your shovelware. I'll say this. That I had that Wheel of Fortune game. That's a pretty good game. That's still a pretty good game. And then you had a few what we call hidden gems. These were games that were made for the Sega CD that really shined on the Sega CD and made it worth owning. And the easiest example to point to would be Lunar the Silver Star, which does have a PlayStation port as well as, I believe, subsequent ports on other more modern consoles. But it was made for the Sega CD at the time, and it was a damn good game at the time. I had Lunar the Silver Star on Sega CD. There's somewhere between 125-ish to 160-ish titles. I'm using the word title on the Sega CD because not all titles are games. There's interactive CD ROMs. There's interactive encyclopedias. There's educational software. There's a like a demo disc. There's like the tour, a museum tour disc. Things like that. So there's software that's not video game software on the Sega CD, which, that type of software exists pretty much on all video game consoles in some form or another in limited quantities. So there is that. I would say about 70% of the Sega CD games are worth owning. Now we've talked enough about Sega CD. Let's move on. Let's talk about the 3DO briefly. The 3DO was probably the first dedicated CD-ROM based home console. The CDI being more of a multimedia machine. Technically, the 3DO was marketed as a multimedia machine, but it came with an actual video game controller. It was made by a company that made video games, and it was pretty much pushed as a game console. Whereas the CDI wasn't. The CDI was sort of one of those, oops, I guess we can put games on it too kind of deals. And then they tried to market it as a game console and failed. But the 3DO was a true game console. And a lot of good games were released on the 3DO. Just a couple of highlights would be the Need for Speed and Gex and PO'd. Those were some good games. Like the Sega CD and the other CD-ROM games at the time, as well as any game console for that matter, yeah, there's a lot of shovelware and rubbish on the 3DO, but you can't judge the system based on the worst games on the system. You got to look at the best games on the system. You got to look at Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. You know, you got to look at games like that. So there are some good quality games on the 3DO. But like I said, I'm really saving the meat and potatoes of the 3DO discussion for the 32-bit era video. Where it's relevant here is it was a CD-ROM based system, and it was one of the first CD-ROM based systems, not the actual true technical first, but for all intents and purposes, the first dedicated one. More or less. Next, we have the Jaguar CD, which is a literal piece of shit and has absolutely zero games worth talking about. So it's just a footnote in CD-ROM history, and that's it. Now, there was also the Neo Geo CD, which was a dedicated CD-ROM console that was made by SNK that did play Neo Geo software, but it was Neo Geo arcade games put on CD-ROMs, not on cartridges. But it was the same games that were on the cartridge console that they had already sold. So again, it was just the same games that already existed. There were no exclusive games, to my knowledge, on the Neo Geo CD. And the Neo Geo CD is not an attachment to the Neo Geo, which it probably should have been. But given how expensive the Neo Geo was, I don't know. Maybe this was like them trying to get some sales. I don't know. Whatever. It is what it is. Obviously, you still had other dedicated CD-ROM game consoles. You know, you had the Saturn, you had the PlayStation, and the last one being the Dreamcast, which I know technically uses GD-ROM, but it's just CD-ROM without the copy protection, and without the copy protection, and without the what's it called, error correction is all it is, so they could fit more room on the disc. So it's still CD-ROM, more or less. You can put pirate ROM images of Dreamcast games on an actual CD-ROM and they'll still fucking play. Which, for the most part, most of these CD-ROM game consoles will play pirate discs without any mod chips or anything. I say most of them. There are exceptions, but I'm not going to get into that. The CD-ROM era ended with the launch of the PS2 when we shifted to DVDs. But there were still games released on CD-ROM for the PS2, although not very many. So what are my overall impressions of the CD-ROM era? And we're not even talking about the Laserdisc stuff, so fuck off, you nerds typing away in the comments. Talking about Laser Vision and CD32 and shit like that. Which, again, that was exclusive to Europe, so it doesn't exist. My overall impression is the CD-ROM era pretty much laid the groundwork for modern games. Modern, bigger, epic, story-driven games with more gameplay available to them. The limitations of cartridges and floppy disks on computers at the time really limited what you could do with a video game on a home console or home computer. Whereas once CD-ROM came on the scene, you know, you had some wiggle room. You had some room to play around, and you could try new things and experiment. So kudos to the CD-ROM era for being very experimental. Most, but not all, most of the highlights are going to be on the Sega CD, with a few pretty solid titles on the 3DO as well. Everything else that was released on CD-ROM consoles, again, comes on Saturn, PlayStation, Dreamcast, which are in the 32-bit era. We'll talk about those later. Well, Dreamcast is kind of fishy, but that's a whole nother topic. Now, there were some variations of some of these consoles. The Turbo CD was released as a machine called the Turbo Duo, which could play CD-ROM discs, TurboGrafx, and TurboGrafx Hue cards as well. And it had some other bells and whistles. There was also the JVC XI, which was a third-party Sega CD compatible machine, which was basically just a Genesis and a Sega CD meshed together in one machine, as well as the portable CDX released by Sega themselves, which was basically a portable CD player that could also hook up to your TV and play Sega CD games. That also had a cartridge slot for playing Genesis titles as well. These things are ultra fucking rare and probably impossible to find in working condition, so don't even bother. Sega CD came in two formats for the Genesis. You had the Model 1 Genesis, which had the Model 1 Sega CD, and then the Model 2 Genesis had the Model 2 Sega CD. Now, you could technically hook up a Model 2 Genesis to a Model 1 Sega CD, and you could hook up a Model 2 Sega CD to a Model 1 Genesis. It just took a little finagling on that end. But it was technically possible at the time, and is even to this day. 3DO is difficult because, and it should probably get its own video actually, because the 3DO, actually I think I've already done a video on the 3DO. The company that made 3DO did not manufacture 3DO machines. What they did was license the specs to other companies. So Panasonic made one, Gold Star made one, and I believe Sanyo made one as well. There may have been other manufacturers making them in Japan, I don't know. But it was not a successful system anywhere in any market, so it doesn't matter. And yes, I know technically there are other CD-ROM based dedicated consoles and CD-ROM add-ons for other consoles in foreign markets, but we're not talking about those because I don't know anything about them. I barely know of the Amiga CD32. I don't know enough about it to talk about it, and I don't even have a clue what they had in Japan. And I don't fucking care because I don't live in Japan. I live in the US, and that's all I care about. So overall, I would say the CD-ROM era, if I'm being honest, does have, by and large, more duds than hits. If you take it as a whole, Turbo, Neo Geo, Jaguar, CDI, 3DO, Sega CD. However, individually, the Sega CD has more gems than duds. And the 3DO, it's about a 50-50 split, more or less. It might be 60-40, 40 being the good games, 60% being the shit games. I don't know, but it's about 50-50. I haven't actually sat down and counted and done the math, but just from what I know of it. I am a fan of the early days of CD-ROM technology. If I had the money and I was so inclined, I would get a Sega CD. I would get a 3DO. I had a CDI in the past. I will never buy another one. Again, I have no use for it. I would never buy a Jaguar CD in a million years, even if you gave one to me for free. And I don't think there's anything that would justify me ever getting a Neo Geo CD or a TurboGrafx CD or a Turbo Duo. I just don't have any interest in the software library on those two platforms as well. Now, there were some other, like I said, bells and whistles on the CD-ROM in the CD-ROM era. And one of them was karaoke discs. The Sega CD in particular was compatible with karaoke discs. So you could use it, kind of, as a karaoke machine. And this was known as CD plus graphics. But there weren't a ton of these released at the time. So I don't know what's out there in that format. I just don't know. It's not very well documented in my research, which I haven't done any research in a long, long time. To my knowledge, two of the CD-ROM consoles, the CDI and the 3DO, both have MPEG card upgrades that allow you to play video CDs on them. But again, video CD was very quickly replaced when DVD came on the scene. I believe in 1998 or 1996. I'm not 100% on that. But definitely within a couple of years of introduction, it was already obsolete. It didn't last long, at least in the U.S. Now, video CD did exist in the U.S. and titles were released in the North American market on video CD, but there's not very many of them. I have a list of 125 confirmed titles that were sold in the U.S. on video CD, and they were all published by Polygram, which is Philips's multimedia division. So they were published by Philips themselves. However, this is hard to track down because a lot of these found their way in the Asian markets anyways, because that's where the video CD took off. So, a lot of sellers were finding out that's where the market was. So these games migrated to Japan and Korea and places like that. And some of them have made their way back to the U.S. through eBay and things like that. But for the most part, video CD, at least in the U.S., was very short-lived. I believe it was only officially supported for 3 years. So that's as far as I know, besides the fact that they can all play audio CDs, which they were good audio CD players at the time. There's not much else to say about the CD-ROM era, honestly. It's one of the more fascinating eras, at least from a technological standpoint, because it did some fascinating stuff, and it did push the technology forward pretty well. It did a really good job of pushing technology. So, kudos to that.